Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. In this episode, I'm excited to talk a little bit about Randonautica and randonauting. I've been wanting to do an episode or two about randonauting for a while because it's something that I really enjoy doing. It's just a really fun, free, easy way to kind of infuse some adventure into your life, some strangeness into your life, etc. So let's get into it. What is Randonautica? If you haven't heard of it, Randonautica is a free app that you can download to your phone. You set an intention in your mind, you don't type it anywhere in the app, and then it generates a random point near you for you to visit. And then you visit that place. It's as simple as that. And yet it's got a lot of complexity and lore and interesting stuff associated with it. And many people who use the app, including me, have noticed an unusual number of synchronicities or kind of just unusual things that you stumble across while using it that might say something about maybe yourself or something going on in your life right now. Maybe it's just connected to the intention you set. Maybe something else is going on, etc. And it's also just a great way to get out and explore your area. The app became very popular in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. That's because the beta version of the app came out in early 2020, right before the pandemic started, and people latched onto it as a fun thing that you can do outside, near where you live. And since then, it's almost taken on the character of an urban legend because of all the different viral content that surrounded it. I know some people made up stories about weird things that happened to them. Some people really did have weird things happen to them, etc. So kind of very quickly, it's gathered some of the trappings of urban legend, but it remains this really interesting and mysterious tool that you can engage with maybe your subconscious using, maybe something paranormal, maybe something else, etc. And the general idea is that the app breaks you out of your daily routine and out of your mundane reality, and it basically takes you on an adventure. Ideally, it also gets you to engage more with your own life, getting you away from screens for a bit and breaking you out of the routine of social media, TV shows, etc. that we often end up filling up our free time with. I've been using the app for about 2 years, on and off. I think I started using it in March 2020. If not then possibly April 2020. And I can say it's definitely interesting. It has led me to a number of synchronicities. With me, it seems to have a sense of humor. And at least one time, it's tried to give me a very specific message to warn me about something, which I foolishly decided to ignore. I'll get into my own experiences while using Randonautica in the next episode, but this time I just want to talk about what the app is and how to use it and some of the theories behind it. But before I get into that, I do want to acknowledge my main source for this episode. So most of the time when I do episodes, especially when they're really research heavy, I have dozens and dozens of sources, and I only mention sources if I'm really citing something directly or quoting it directly, and otherwise they're just in my show notes. But this episode relies really, really heavily on one book, which is The Official Guide to Randonautica: Everything You Need to Know About Creating Your Random Adventure Story by Joshua Langfelder and Auburn Salcedo. That was published in 2021, and I've read it twice so far in 2022. I initially read it in January, I think, on audio. And then when I realized I wanted to do this episode, I decided to reread it as an ebook so that way I could actually quote parts of it and make notes and highlight things, etc. I don't own the physical book, but I did see it in a bookstore the other day, and it's really cool, like the way it's designed. It's a really nice package, so I recommend picking up that book in any of those 3 formats. I can say 2 of the 3 are great, and the physical book looks like it's cool too. If you find anything that I'm talking about today interesting, you should pick up the book because I'll be pulling a lot of stuff from the book, but it goes into so much detail about a lot of things that I sort of only slightly kind of understand. So it's a great book to pick up. The Official Guide to Randonautica, everything you need to know about creating your random adventure story. So let's get into just a quick history of Randonautica. I'll just hit the broad strokes. But I have mentioned this in some of the Fordham episodes where I talked about psychogeography, but back in the mid-20th century, a philosopher named Guy Debord came up with this idea of the dérive or drift. The idea is that during the dérive, you go on an unplanned walk through a landscape, usually an urban one, and the Randonautica book, which I'm just going to call it like the book or the Randonautica book because the title's too long for me to say over and over, but the Randonautica book describes it really well, so I wanted to read a bit from that. The idea was to reshape how people view cities and to develop a more holistic perspective on the urban environment as a living, breathing creature. If you want to know more about psychogeography and dérives and that whole history of that sort of thinking about cities, there's obviously a ton of books you can read about it, but a book that I talked about in some of the Fordham episodes that I did is Psychogeography by Merlin Coverley. It is a really good primer that mentions a bunch of other books, and then from there, you can dive into the books that that book mentions. So check that out. So what does the dérive have to do with Randonautica? Randonautica is a lot like a dérive, but it goes a bit further because it gives the randonaut a specific destination, a specific point to go to, and it also uses technology to make the trip really random. Oh, and the person using Randonautica is called a randonaut, and you call it randonauting, and the term comes from the words random and nautical to mean randomness explorer. So inspired by some of these ideas, Randonautica became a thing. Before it was an app, there was a randonauting subreddit, of course. People in the community were giving random coordinates and weird stuff started happening. Some of the big observations that people made about these early trips was that often different people's trips would have weird connections, even though they were strangers. People often felt similar feelings to each other, like despair or fear. Other people went to a point and then found just weirdness, like maybe someone is behaving a little bit strangely, walking in circles or staring into space, just something that seems almost like glitched out, I feel like is how I would describe that. And animals were also acting oddly. There's a really fun story that the book tells about how owls started appearing during people's trips. Like, not necessarily always real owls, but sometimes, figurines, etc. People were really baffled, but then it turned out that one of the developers at Randonautica had found a weird antique owl statue while randonauting, and he just happened to put that statue on top of the server that was generating the random points. So as an experiment, the developers tried placing other things on top of the server to see whether people would see them on their trips. And of course they did. They tried it out with salt and with a meteorite, which led to people seeing UFOs. So that's just a little taste of some of the strangeness that seems to crop up around randonauting and Randonautica. For a while, it was just a bot on Telegram, giving people points. Then it was a bot on a website. And I remember in 2020, sometimes using the website bot. It might have been when the app was having downtime or something, but I remember kind of using both that bot some and the app. But in February 2020, the beta version of the Randonautica app was released and it really quickly went viral. There was a hashtag that was like hashtag Randonaut Challenge, and the app also got a lot of press, some of it negative, because there was a huge story, which if you kind of don't know what Randonautica is, you still might know this story. There was a huge news story in 2020 about some randonauts who found a suitcase with a body in it on a beach in Seattle. And it helped solve this crime story, this disappearance. But that's obviously not what you want to find on a randonauting trip. And it caused a large stir and drove even more people to this weird app. So next, let's look at how Randonautica works and sort of what it's doing. Part of the idea behind Randonautica is that it breaks you out of your probability tunnel, which the book defines as, quote, an abstract representation of the idea that limited decision-making possibilities based on a human's previous experiences and patterns create a likely probable response. So that definition might be a little hard to parse. The book explains it with a bunch of good metaphors and examples, but think about it this way. Every day you wake up in the morning and you eat breakfast, and you probably choose from one of a couple of your typical breakfast foods, and maybe you eat it while watching or listening to something that you typically watch, etc. If you work outside of the house, you might walk the same way to the train or bus stop, or drive the same route to work every day. You're probably not going to deviate from that routine very often, or if you do, it's because you're going somewhere specific, like you're going to the grocery store that you always go to, or to a park that you like, or to a friend's house, etc. So you have this routine of non-random things that you do every day, which take you down the same path every day. And that path is your probability tunnel. Now, you might not know you're in your probability tunnel, which makes it even harder to break out of. But in your life, you don't really end up making random decisions, which means you could be missing a lot of stuff that's outside of your probability tunnel, right? And for me, this idea of a probability tunnel is like existentially awful. I think especially because so much of our lives these days are dictated by algorithms, like the media we consume, the things we see on social media, etc. It gets recommended to you based on your past behavior. So it feels to me like random things are like harder and harder to come across. At least that's how it feels to me. And it feels like there's this sense of like someone else guiding my life at times. And I think it's really easy to feel like you're an autopilot. And I know, of course, I'm talking about an app telling me where to go and then following that app. But just the idea that that app is based off of randomness that may be influenced by an intention that I set, that I chose to set, that's comforting to me. I don't know if this is a thing you think about on an existential level, but for me, I find the existence of Randonautica and this sense of being able to infuse a little bit of randomness into your daily life, I find it really comforting. So I wanted to read a little bit from the book, kind of elaborating on this idea of the probability tunnel. Let's assume there were an infinite number of small occurrences that had to happen in order for you to be in this precise time and space. What role did you consciously play? What if every move you've made, emotional responses, left turns, right turns, choices in relationships, your work, your hobbies, the media you've consumed, and all your other habits had been a part of a predetermined order of your life? In other words, your probability tunnel. A long, narrow, enclosed path that you follow aimlessly day to day. How can you escape it? You're basically operating like a human algorithm. So again, Randonautica is meant to break you out of this algorithm or matrix. And it's not a matrix like in the movie The Matrix, where the world is fake. It's more about just changing your perspective in our world, right? Ideally, it'll take you to new places and maybe challenge some of your beliefs about the world and how reality works, and even about things in your life. And for me, Randonautica has done sort of all of the above. It has broken my routine, it's shown me cool stuff, and like I said, it has sent me some pretty clear messages at times. And I guess for me, something that I really like about Randonautica is that it makes this idea of the paranormal or the metaphysical or whatever you want to call it, it makes it more accessible. And what I mean by that is, let's say you are into paranormal investigation. You know, last episode, I talked all about this way to make paranormal investigation easier, have a lower barrier to entry, etc. And, I just gave one method. Of course, there's many different ways you can kind of make it a little easier for yourself. You don't have to book an expensive trip somewhere. You can do things near your home, alone, etc. But Randonautica, to me, makes it even easier, right? Like, I've used Randonaut way more times than I've used the solo Estes method, because still, if I'm going to go somewhere and do that, I have to choose where I want to go. The weather has to be nice. I have to have time to do it, time to listen back to the results. And, it's a very accessible way to do paranormal investigation. It's much faster than taking a train or even a plane somewhere far away, but still it's a deviation from my normal routine. And by that I mean it's a special thing that I do sometimes, but I gotta set aside a special amount of time for it, a specific time to do it, etc. Whereas Randonautica is just so much faster and so much easier because you don't have all this equipment that you need to buy and then set up and etc. You just have this app on your phone and you can work it into your daily life. So one thing that I do sometimes is I will go for a run and let Randonaut decide where I'm going to run. And sometimes I just do it once, sometimes I do it multiple times throughout a run. But, I'm going for that run no matter what. But it's a way to infuse something strange and interesting into that run. And for me also, it feels like this extra touch point with, again, whatever you want to call it, the paranormal, the anomalous, whatever, because in so many cases, I come across something meaningful or strange or related to my intention, etc. And I don't know about you, but for me, I'm a skeptical believer. I do think that paranormal stuff exists. There's weird stuff we can't explain, etc. But it's very hard for me to silence that skeptic part in my brain. And the only thing that really does it is by having firsthand experiences of just unusual stuff. So, I have had that. I've talked about that in a Fordham series. I talked about paranormal experiences I've had, talked about investigation I've done, etc. But it's almost like I need this constant reminder that there's something there, both to silence my innate skepticism, but also just because it feels like the further I get from an anomalous or paranormal experience, the less real it all feels, and like the fewer things happen to me. I don't know if you have experienced this, but I find that weird things tend to happen to me in clusters, where like nothing will happen for a while, and then a ton of weird stuff happens all at once, and then nothing happens for a while. And it almost feels like I'm tapping into this thing that then, I don't know, it's like a spring, and I've tapped the spring and more water comes out or whatever, right? But if you're not looking for it, maybe you'll come across a natural spring, but maybe not. I don't know that this spring metaphor works, but you know what I mean. Over the last couple of years, I have kept pretty meticulous records of anything strange that's happened to me, and a lot of stuff in my notebooks is related to Randonautica. And I do think it has applications for paranormal investigation. I would really love to go to the cemetery belt here in Queens and kind of have it send me to different places in cemeteries, maybe almost see if I can communicate with somebody there, and say like, bring me to someone who might want to communicate, etc. Like, I think there are some really interesting paranormal investigation type applications you can use Randonautica for. And I haven't really experimented with those, but they're out there, and I think that's cool. But even if that's not your thing, it's just, this way to have an adventure in your daily life. And I've gone really off script, as usual, but I guess to get back to what I was talking about, I was talking about how Randonautica works, and this is getting into that area that I don't really understand. But there are some theories about mind-matter interaction and destroying Cartesian dualism. dualism is the idea that your mind is separate from physical reality. But at this point, I can't really explain it much better than that. If you want to know more about it, there is a great video by the YouTuber Thought Slime about non-dualism, which explains it a lot better than I can. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes, but I think if you just type into YouTube Thought Slime non-dualism, it should come up. I probably need to watch the video a few more times and read a little bit more about it, and then maybe it'll sink through into my head. But that's one theory behind what Randonautica is doing. And it is also tied in with setting intentions and like why it works to set an intention in your brain and have a app using a random number generator or, an algorithm to generate a place for you to go that then is connected, usually, to something related to your intention. So, of course, there's a bunch of different ways you could explain this, but the most compelling theory for me is this idea that I guess there have been some studies about that have shown this is possible. There's this idea that humans may be able to influence random number generators. So there's this group called the Global Consciousness Project that studies this. Much like with dualism, I really struggle to describe and articulate the concept. So I wanted to read a little bit about this from the Randonautica book. The Global Consciousness Project studies the ability of consciousness to influence RNGs, which those are random number generators. At a very basic level, they study the connection between minds and intentions and the distribution of random data they've collected from devices. The project's experiments have pointed toward the possibility that human consciousness— this is me cutting in real quick. I keep saying consciousness incorrectly, and I keep re-recording this and re-recording this, so I know I'm going to mispronounce consciousness a few times in this. I'm sorry. I do know how to say it. I just can't say it over and over. Anyway, to continue. The project's experiments have pointed toward the possibility that human consciousness interacts with RNG devices at the quantum physical level. Specifically, one set of experiments found that when they put an RNG at a location where groups of humans were at a high level of coherence, like at an opera, where a large number of people were listening to the same music and feeling the same emotions, the devices deviated from the expected normal distribution of random numbers. The results of the experiments suggested that when people gathered together are on the same vibe or wavelength, the resonant energy produced will create unexpected effects on the RNGs. Interestingly, when they placed RNGs in busy shopping malls or places that lacked the resonant coherence of a group, they found that RNGs did not deviate significantly from the normal expected outcome. The researchers at the Global Consciousness Project went on to create a network of RNGs across the globe, referred to as the EGG, which stands for electrogaiagram, that would pick up on large-scale events that seem to affect the global intelligent field. Events such as the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, showed high levels of coherence among the RNGs of the EGG. These events drastically affected human consciousness and seemed to have a measurable effect on the RNGs, causing them to output data that was less random than expected. If you want to know more about this, I included some links in the show notes at buriedcircuitspodcast.com, so check that out. There's definitely a lot more you can read about it, and it's very interesting. But basically, the point here is that this could all be a way that our intentions affect the points we get on the Randonautica app. Oh, and also, I'm going to talk about this in much more detail next time, but while rereading this Randonautica book, when I got to the part about the brain affecting random number generators, I actually had a really strange synchronicity happen. If you follow me on Instagram and watch my stories, you know what I'm talking about. If not, I'll get into it next time. But it's worth noting that it seems like even, for me at least, interacting with some of these concepts in Randonautica, kind of unusual things happen. Things that feel like they could have happened on a Randonautica trip happen without me even necessarily interacting with the app. So it's something I'm going to keep an eye on, but it's totally fascinating to me. Oh, and one other thing too, tied into theories behind how Randonautica works, or kind of like what Randonautica is doing. Randonautica could also be considered a type of remote viewing, right? Like maybe you are viewing where the thing you're looking for is, and the app is responding to you deciding where you want it to be or where you want it to take you, and you just aren't aware that you're doing that. Definitely seems possible. So next, I wanted to just really quickly touch on some criticisms of Randonautica. I know there are probably others in addition to these critiques, but I don't really want to spend a lot of this episode talking about why I think this doesn't work. I'm sure if you Google it, there's plenty of people with plenty of reasons why Randonautica isn't real or why it's a hoax or why people are lying or whatever. But these criticisms are the ones that feel to me like the most valid and the ones in best faith. Just because I don't feel that a criticism of paranormal phenomena that's basically just like, oh, well, none of this is real just because, I don't feel like that's a good faith criticism of odd things or, anomalous things. But there are some fine criticisms of Randonautica. One of them is that some skeptics of Randonautica say that the strange encounters and synchronicities that people experience using the app is just the result of the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, which is when you learn something new and you suddenly see that thing everywhere. So for example, if I go randonauting with the intention of flamingo, maybe I'll suddenly notice a bunch of lawn flamingos that I'd walked by before but never paid attention to. And this is actually something that I think about pretty often while randonauting and wonder if it's at play here. Like, maybe, but for me, I've had enough interesting things happen to me that I don't feel that it's the only thing at play. And also people say that it's an example of confirmation bias. You're looking for things, for evidence to support your existing beliefs. So if you think that Randonautica works, and you're like, I'm going to go on this trip and encounter something related to my intention, then the whole time you're looking for something related to your intention. Of course that's the case. And I wouldn't actually argue that it's impossible for confirmation bias to take place when using Randonautica. I'm sure it's a thing. And these are two things that I think about a lot while randonauting. So a lot of the time, if I'm looking for something that could have kind of a lot of things associated with it, I actually kind of like throw out a lot of stuff. And what I mean by that is, for example, once I went randonauting with the intention of diamond. And as I'm going for my walk or run, can't remember which, I'm looking around, I'm seeing diamonds everywhere, right? Suddenly I'm seeing all these Mitsubishis that I'm passing, and their logo's it's like a clover made out of diamonds, basically, right? But in looking at those, I was like, well, those aren't intentional diamonds, right? Like, that's just a car that someone happened to buy. That's not like a diamond that someone put here in the landscape and was like, here is a diamond. However, on that same trip, I passed by an apartment building that had rails on the balcony and also rails on the fence around the small parking lot or large driveway. And on these rails, there were diamonds in the middle of this, iron, I guess, bar, every one of them. And there was a diamond inset, and each diamond was painted gold. And the paint seemed fairly fresh, like there was no chipping, no scratches, no nothing. And that, to me, I was like, okay, this isn't just like seeing a Mitsubishi on the block. This is like someone bought these rails and recently went through and repainted each of these diamonds gold for me to walk by. And, you can randonaut however you want. I'm not saying you should throw out things related to your intention if you don't want to. But for me, I take note of everything. But for me, I find it really useful to set sort of some guidelines about what feels significant on my trips, just because I have to appease my inner skeptic, and I am thinking about confirmation bias and the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, etc. And I can't not think about that. So I think those are totally valid criticisms, but based on my experiences, I don't think that's all that's happening with Randonautica. So next, I want to go into a little bit more detail about how you use Randonautica. If you've never used it before, it can maybe be a little bit confusing at first. So To go to the very beginning, it's an app that's available for Android and iOS. So of course, first you want to download the app. The current version of the app has coins called OWL tokens that you need to claim in order to use it, but it gives you a bunch of free ones. So just follow the prompts to claim the free daily tokens. You get new ones every day. I've never run out, but if you do a lot of trips in one day or a lot of a certain kind of trip in one day, then you might run out. So if you run out, or if you just want to support the developers, which is always a good thing to do, you can buy more of them. Then you go to the point finder section of the menu, and then you should see a map of where you are. You've got to have your location services on, etc. You can change the radius of the map, or the radius of the circle on the map. I think that the smallest size is 1 kilometer. That's as small as I've been able to get it, at least. And that's the area that the app will generate points within. The app uses an algorithm to generate a bunch of random points within that radius. And I will say, probably the larger you do the radius, or the larger you make the radius, the better results you'll probably get. Because there have been times when I've done something with a really, really small radius, and Randonautica did give me something interesting, but it was something that's like, it felt intentional, but it felt almost like someone was like, you're giving me nothing to work with. Here's something that's kind of related. Or here's something that you can interpret as being related, right? Because just like the more space there is to work with, the more likely it is that there'll be something interesting in that radius that it's looking through. So next, you're going to want to choose whether you want it to look for anomalies or blind spots. If you select anomalies, it's going to look for areas where the random points that the app generates are either really close together, those are the attractors, or more spread out, which the app calls voids, or just the most anomalous area, which is called power. Basically, it's looking for something out of the ordinary. According to the book, some people have reported that void spots tend to feel eerie, airy, and as if they lack or, are void of energy. Some people say that they feel despair or uneasiness when they select this option, but other people like it. And then some people say that attractors tend to bring people to places with more things to see, but as the book points out, this could just be confirmation bias. So instead of anomalies, if you wanted, you could choose blind spots, which are just random points. Within blind spots, you can choose quantum or pseudo. Pseudo coordinates are mathematically random, and quantum coordinates have something to do with quantum something. I'm sorry, I don't really understand what they are or what it means. I've tried to figure it out. I'm one of those people who needs to read or hear something at least like 3 to 6 times before I understand it. So if I got any of these explanations wrong, I'm sorry, but I find some of these concepts a little challenging to understand and articulate, but I think you're getting the general gist, right? So once you've chosen what options you want to use to generate the point, you set your intention by thinking about it and you click the generate button and it generates a point for you. Once your point is generated, you'll notice a little bit more jargon. So you'll get stats for z-score and power. I'll read from the Randonautica book to explain what z-score means because I took stats 15 years ago. And while I assume I learned about z-scores, that's not something I've needed to use since, so I have no idea what it is. All right, to read from the book. Z-score tells you how many standard deviations you are from the mean. The higher the z-score, the further it is from the normal expected distribution. Z-score is used in Randonautica to show the likelihood that a certain point has been influenced by consciousness. Z-scores greater than 5 are considered interesting because the deviation from the normal expected outcome is so far outside of chance that the scientists studying Randonautica hypothesize the point has likely been influenced by the operator's conscious intent. In the example of the Randonautica algorithm, which lays out thousands of random points and measures how densely they cluster, the z-score tells us how unlikely that cluster was to occur. If an attractor has a power of 5, that means it is 5 times more dense than the average amount of points on the map. The higher the score, the denser the cluster of random points, and the more likely that it has been influenced by intention. The concept of power level also comes into play here. If you imagine the distribution of random points as forming hills and valleys, the power level gives you an idea of how high or low these valleys are, while the z-score represents volume, e.g., how many pounds of soil are in those hills. All right, you got all that? Anyway, that's the z-score and the power level. So you've got your point on the map, you've got your z-score and power level there for reference. At that point, I always like to click the little bookmark button on the app and label the bookmark with my intention. So that way it's easy to refer back to later when reflecting on the trip. I don't know if this is just a me thing or just an Android thing or just a thing that's happened on earlier releases of the app and I just haven't changed what I'm doing. But I have found times where I've, generated the point, locked my phone screen, run for, 15 minutes or whatever, got near the point, unlocked my phone to check exactly where the point is. And then I've noticed that it's kind of like lost the point, like it's gone back to the main screen. So that's another reason why I like to bookmark it, just because if for some reason that happens, it'll be easy for you to just go to your bookmarks and go back to the point. So then you go to your point and you pay attention to anything interesting that you encounter or experience during your journey to the point or at the point. And I would say if you can, document your experiences so you can look at them later. I can be a little bit lazy sometimes. These days, I generally do a pretty good job of documenting my trips, but sometimes I put it off and then forget to add it to my notebook or make any notes about it, even on my phone. So I really strongly suggest that you document your trips right away because you will want to look back at them later. As with any paranormal type experience, if you're anything like me, your brain tries to erase the stuff that's like strange or unusual and replace it with, more mundane explanation. And you forget some of the strangest and most striking things about an odd experience. So I don't know if that's just me or if other people have a tendency to do that, but I find it really useful to write down paranormal stuff because of that. And then also, it's really helpful to see all of your randonauting journeys in one place so that way you can be like, oh, wow, there's really a theme here. Or, just see what patterns come up. See how different z-scores and power levels and settings have affected what you found, etc. Having a log of your, honestly, paranormal experiences in general is going to make it a lot easier for you to kind of draw conclusions from it or connect the dots a little bit, etc. So before I wrap up this episode, I did want to talk about safety factors to remember while randonauting. So Randonautica themselves have a whole set of rules for being safe, which I wanted to review real quick. So the official Randonautica rules are, and this is me paraphrasing, don't trespass on private property, stay away from dangerous areas, don't randonaut at night, bring a trash bag so you can pick up litter, charge your phone, especially since GPS is so battery draining, be positive in your intentions, don't randonaut alone, only go where you feel comfortable, use common sense, and enjoy the journey, not just the point you're directed to. I'll include a link to the Randonauting 101 page on their website if you want to refer to that for more info on any of these guidelines. So I think these are great guidelines for the most part. I will say that I randonaut a lot at night, but I live in New York City, so that's totally different from being somewhere remote and dark. There's always lots of people around anytime I'm anywhere, honestly. If you live somewhere that's not New York City, it probably is good advice not to randonaut at night. And I mentioned this in the last episode when talking about, investigating the paranormal alone when you're out and about, but a number of GPS devices and apps let you send your location to your emergency contact so they can keep an eye on where you are for safety. So it might be worth doing that while randonauting as well. I think that iOS devices have this built in now, but I'm an Android user, so can't tell you anything more than that. If you're an iOS user, you probably already know. Other things, you probably want to bring snacks and water for while you're out. I always have snacks and water on me because I'm hungry and thirsty all the time, but you might end up getting sidetracked and being out longer than you expected to be, especially if you're in any kind of hiking type situation. So make sure you have snacks and water. One thing that the book mentions is that sometimes the actual point will be in a body of water or on private property. so you'll only be able to get near the point. That's totally fine. It should still yield interesting things. Don't go into a body of water where it's probably not safe for you to be or on private property, etc. The book also recommends meditation and grounding yourself. That can especially help if you feel anxiety or fear about going to an unknown location. There are lots of great ways to ground yourself, but if you don't know where to begin, honestly, just search YouTube and you'll find tons of options for guided grounding meditations. You can see what you like there and go from there. So I wanted to spend also a little bit more time talking about intentions, because I do think that can affect your safety. The book talks about latent or conflicting intentions and suggests using this method to try to resolve them. So I'll read this. A good exercise is to write down all of your desires and see if any of them conflict with one another. Sometimes you think you want something, but deep down you really don't. Part of setting a good intention is knowing what you want. You should be extremely brief and really think about the words you are using to formulate your intention. It doesn't hurt to start looking up the specific meaning of the words you are using in the dictionary. And, if you do any kind of magic or occult practice, this sort of thing, I'm sure sounds very familiar to you. But I definitely have not been this methodical in my randonauting, though I'm sure I would benefit from it. And I have found that I've run into latent or conflicting intentions for sure. And it's little things, many, many times from maybe the second or third time I used Randonautica to present day, I am I'm going to go for a walk to, let's say, a specific cemetery. And then I think about it, I'm I don't think I want to go there. I am kind of tired. I'll just randonaut, I'll set the radius smaller than the distance to the cemetery, and I'll just hang out around here, whatever. Again and again, when I do that, if I've set the radius so that it doesn't quite get to the point that I had been thinking about going, it brings me right to the edge of the radius right by that point. And if I've accidentally set the radius large enough so that I could still potentially go to the place I decided not to go, it brings me right there. And my guess is that even though I decided not to go to that place for whatever reason, I'm still thinking about it, it's still in my brain, and that's conflicting with whatever intention I've set. So that's a pretty innocent and harmless way that maybe my not so great intention setting has affected randonauting trips, but I do think in general you should be wary and careful about your intentions no matter what you're doing. But, here we're specifically talking about randonauting, and you should make sure that you're not setting yourself up to be led to something unpleasant. Now, if you'll allow me a digression, this sort of falls within the bounds of sensible paranormal investigation guidelines. So for example, I do think it's worth ensuring that you're in a stable enough mental state to be interacting with the unknown, whether you're randonauting or investigating the paranormal, etc. In the last episode, I alluded to some of my own struggles with mental health and how I try to avoid paranormal investigation, spirit communication, and just too much contact, really any contact with the unknown, when I'm feeling bad. And, there's lots of good reasons for that, but the biggest one for me is that I, at least, have a tendency to get reckless when I'm in a bad mental state. I am naturally an extremely curious person, and I can be curious to a fault when I am, for example, very depressed. For me, that's because my self-preservation instincts are low in that state, and I end up with a, I don't care what happens, throw anything at me attitude, which even in the moment I know is not good. But that's just how I feel in that moment, and that can be a really dangerous thing. It has led me to the occasional unpleasant paranormal experience, nothing where I actually felt like I was in danger for real. But also the experiences I'm thinking about are things that happened where I lived, paranormal related stuff that happened in the safety of the four walls of my home. If you're going out and about, there are a lot more elements of uncertainty, and it's not just psychic danger that you're setting yourself up for potentially, it's also physical danger. There could be something dangerous at a point if you are not necessarily in a great state to be setting intentions, etc. Now, I'm not trying to say if you have a bad experience with Randonautica, it's your fault or anything, but I just think it's something important to think about. Even with Randonautica, I often take a break for a few months if I'm just not feeling into it. Like there have been points where I've been like, oh, I should randonaut on my run today. And then I just like have this feeling where I'm like, no, I shouldn't. I can't do that. It stresses me out. I can't do it. That's probably tied to something I'm going to talk about next time, which is this idea of like fear when using Randonautica or the despair meme. But it's definitely something that like as much as I love Randonautica, I run into sometimes where I'm just like, no, I can't do it. I don't want to do it. So, I let myself take a break when I need it. Even if I'm not thinking that I have a mental health reason to not use it, still sometimes I'm just like, I don't know, I'm not feeling it, I'm not going to do it. But I do think it's possible to be in a bad enough headspace that you just can't necessarily come up with a safe intention. However, at the same time, I definitely think something like Randonautica can help you get out of the house, go on adventures, and even lead to some self-discovery and reflection. And those are all things that can really, really help folks who are struggling with their mental health, Like it can be hard to go outside, it can be hard to do new things, etc. So I try to listen to my own intuition on this kind of thing and not force it. And I advise you to as well. And if you feel like it's going to help you, then like absolutely, like do what you think is right. I definitely don't want to scare anyone out of doing something that might really help them. Sometimes you just need that sense of wonder, of discovering new things, etc. when you're just not doing that well. So follow your heart. But on the subject of caution when interacting with the paranormal, psychic protection, etc., there is one sort of longer tangent I'd like to get into that I wish I had mentioned last episode, but I was like very focused on the mechanics of like, okay, here's how the solo Estes method works, etc., etc. And then after I released it, I was like, oh crap, I probably should have mentioned some stuff about psychic protection. So hopefully, if you listen to the last episode, you'll listen to this one too. I think they're kind of similar. But if you're new to more active paranormal investigation, like the Estes method variation that I talked about last episode, or, metaphysical exploration like randonauting, then I do think it's worth thinking about psychic self-protection. You don't have to, obviously. Do whatever you want, but it's worth considering. And also, I should give the disclaimer here that I am very much a novice when it comes to this sort of thing. I am not an expert, but there are several techniques that I use that are very important to me, that I use, if not every day, almost every day, whether or not I'm doing anything paranormal, just because I think it's a good thing to just keep up. Just make sure you're maintaining your psychic defenses, etc. So as a non-expert, I personally use two different protection methods. The first one is drawn from my own faith tradition, so I would advise you to look into your own faith for methods of protection, if faith is something you're into. There's probably something there, someone you can call on, etc., to just like keep an eye on you, make sure you're okay, etc. So you'll need to do your own research on that one. So then the other psychic self-protection method that I use is a modified version of the Tower of Light method from the book The Llewellyn Practical Guide to Psychic Self-Defense, which is written by Melita Denning and Osborne Phillips. Oh, and that's Llewellyn spelled Llewellyn. I have an old copy of the book from the 1980s, which you can find for super cheap, like less than $5 on eBay or thrift books or wherever you like to buy your used books. The book, or at least the edition that I have, can be very dated in some of its language and examples, so of course, read with a grain of salt, but it was worth the read for the Tower of Light method. I think there might be a new edition of the book that could be worth picking up, but the title's different, so I'm not totally sure if it's the same, so I don't want to recommend it for sure, but it probably is the same. Like if you see it in a store, look for the Tower of Light. If it has it, you're probably good. So I read this book back in 2018, and I've been using the method ever since. One nice thing about it is that it is designed to work to protect you from psychic dangers, but also from more physical stuff, like from people who might make demands on your time, that innervate you, etc. So I, of course, can't promise that it'll work the same way for you as it does for me, but for me, it's been immensely helpful for life in general in New York City, especially when I used to work in the city. I used to work in the financial district where there were often canvassers and salespeople trying to get you to sign up for things all the time. And multiple times a week, after I started using the Tower of Light, a person with a clipboard would approach me, and then I would do my quick modified version of the Tower of Light, and the person would often turn around and walk away or look away from me and accost someone else instead, etc. And that didn't really happen before I used that method. Again, I'm not sure if it would be as effective for you, but if you're looking for a psychic self-defense technique and you don't know where to start, I think the Llewellyn Practical Guide to Psychic Self-Defense is great for that. And I do know there's a lot of great resources out there for psychic self-defense. So do some research, do some reading. There are a lot of books I have on my list to read about psychic self-defense that I haven't gotten to yet. But for me, these two methods are sufficient for now. So anyway, I know that was a tangent, but I did want to mention it just because I do think it's a safety factor you might want to think about when randonauting or doing any sort of interaction with the paranormal, the unusual, etc. But to bring it back to what started this detour, just be responsible when choosing an intention. Just because if you believe what Randonautica is doing, then the intention is determining where you're being sent. So that's how you use Randonautica. Like I mentioned, if this interests you at all, definitely pick up the book, The Official Guide to Randonautica, Everything You Need to Know About Creating Your Random Adventure Story. The book has been really helpful to me in trying to wrap my head about some of the concepts surrounding Randonautica. It's helped me think about Randonautica in different ways. So pick that up if you're interested. I'll also include a link in the show notes to an interview with Joshua Langfelder that was on the podcast/radio show Night Drift, which is how I heard about the book. It's a really interesting conversation, and it's worth listening to if you want to know more. So next time, I'm going to talk about my own randonauting experiences, and I'll probably also touch on some other important randonauting concepts that I didn't get to this time, like memetics, the despair meme, which I briefly mentioned, and just a little bit more about synchronicity. But I hope you enjoyed hearing about Randonautica. I'm really curious if you have used Randonautica. What is your experience? If you use Randonautica because of this episode, I would love to hear about any weird things that happened to you. It's funny, I feel like I don't know many people, maybe anyone, who I hang out with on a regular basis in real life who uses Randonautica. And honestly, I feel like I don't hear people online talking about Randonautica that much anymore now that it's not viral. You know, I heard people talking about it in 2020. I just don't hear much about it nowadays, but I know people are still using it. And I think it is a really cool thing, especially it's interesting the ways that it could potentially be used in paranormal investigation. And that's, like I said, something I want to dive into more in the future and experiment with more myself. I mentioned this last time, but I have started a Patreon, which you can get to at patreon.com/Buried Secrets Podcast. Right now, it has the Solo Estes Method kit that I put together that I talked about in the last episode that's downloadable and can be used easily. I have lots of plans for other things I want to add to the Patreon as well, and I'll keep you posted as I add them. But you know, this podcast is a one-person show. I research, write, host, edit, do the art for, and promote all by myself. It takes a huge amount of time, and hosting costs, like everything, have gone up this year. So it would be really awesome if you wanted to join the Patreon, though of course I get it if that's not your thing. But if it is your thing and you have thoughts or suggestions about what sort of things you'd like to see on the Patreon, you know, I threw out some ideas last time. I'm very open to, you know, anything that I'm able to reasonably provide. I'm very open to having on Patreon, so just let me know. Other than that, you can check out the show notes for this episode at BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. The email for the show is buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. If you liked this episode, please rate and review it. You can now rate and review on Apple, Spotify, and Podchaser. So it's helpful to me if you rate and review at any of those places. It has come to my attention that Spotify could definitely use some more ratings, because I think right now there aren't enough people who've rated it on Spotify for it to display the actual number rating. So if you're listening on Spotify, if you could just throw me a little 5-star review when you're done listening to this episode, or maybe right now, that would be really awesome. It just helps people find out about the show. And, it provides the social proof that people listen to it, enjoy it, it's worth folks' time, etc. So if you don't mind rating and reviewing, that's a really great way to help me. And I think that's all I've got. Like I said, next time I'll talk more about Randonautica. And then after that, I'm really hoping to get into my Old Alton Bridge series. I spent probably like a year on and off researching my Fordham series. I've spent now several months researching the Old Alton Bridge thing. I'm sure I won't have all the research done by the time I publish the first episode, but I think I'm making good progress. It is a pretty research-intensive topic because I'm really trying to dig beneath the surface, and I've found some really interesting things. So anyway, you can look forward to that, hopefully the episode after next. And that's all I got. Thanks so much for listening.